Slowly, this meeting is being recorded. All right, so I'm really happy to be starting our third day of the Summer Institute after 2 weeks long of boot camp, pre-Summer Institute, and we have a lineup of really excellent speakers this year. Every year we have excellent speakers, but this year I think we have outdone ourselves. It's really like a star-studded speaker series. So today we have Professor Ozge Oner, and I'll briefly introduce her. She's an assistant professor in real estate and spatial economics at the Land Economy Department and a fellow in economics at Sydney Sussex College at the Cambridge University. She's also a research fellow at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. Professor Oner earned her PhD in economics with a focus on urban and regional economics in Jönköping, Sweden. I'm very
As good
sorry
as
that
it gets.
I butchered that totally, but it's okay.
Totally fine.
She completed part of her PhD studies at the Regional Economics Applications Laboratory at the University of Illinois. Her research interests deals with migration and labor mobility, microgeography of segregation and ethnic cleavages, retail and service geography, the geography of entrepreneurship, and as well as political geography. She's a former recipient of the Handelsbanken Wallander Postdoctoral Scholarship in Sweden, Young Investigator Award in Italy, and she is the 2019 recipient of the Young Researcher Award in Sweden. And she writes monthly columns at the newspaper, a Swedish daily that I have no idea how to pronounce. So I'm very sorry about that as well. My Swedish is non-existent, so I'm very, very sorry. But I'd like to give the floor to Professor Oner. We're really lucky to have her because in the past summer institutes, this like spatial dynamics of events, both like social events, that was really like undercovered. And this year we have two on that, and Professor Oner is one of those. So this research on the microgeography of ethnic enclaves and other things, I don't know what they are, but I'm really looking forward to them. So the floor is yours, Professor Oner. Thanks so much for making time for us.
Thank you so much for a great introduction. I'm just trying to figure out how to make this this work. I will spend some time on my general research profile, and I thought this is a good opportunity actually to introduce my literature, which is going to be quite redundant to some of you. I believe at least a few of you will be quite familiar with the spatial economics literature at large. Sometimes we call it urban economics, regional economics. There are spatial data scientists doing their own work. It's a very eclectic realm, a rather empirical one. Everybody is very quantitatively driven. Some of us are doing better job than others when it comes to applications, but I'm an economist sort of going around with a clock, hiding my economist avatar among my geographer friends, and sometimes pretending to be an applied geographer among my economist friends. And so I have these multiple personas, if you may choose to call that. And I think that's going to be quite familiar to some of you who perhaps do not belong to one particular line of literature or a discipline, but trying to do work in multiple areas on issues that are quite attractive to more than one subdiscipline or more than one discipline within social sciences. So to that end, I think I'm home today with most of you, or I hope so. So as Akın mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Spatial Economics. Here we have an interesting department called Department of Land Economy. I very much encourage you guys to take a look at it. It's a very eclectic environment. Its subtitle is Economics, Law, and Environment. So We are 1/3 lawyers doing property law, environmental law, land law. A bunch of us are economists doing urban and regional economics. We have some planners, and we even have people with engineering background doing environmental work. So it's a very mixed bag of people. For historical reasons, the name of the department is land economy. I guess this resembles a lot with some of the faculties, such as agricultural econ faculties in most of the US cities, or there are a few spatial science groups in older European universities. So we are that kind of environment that is a very multidisciplinary environment, not necessarily an interdisciplinary environment. So everybody is something very attached to one particular discipline, but trying to address issues that have some spatial dimension, basically. And you may also be familiar with the Cambridge structure. When we talk about the university, actually, we talk about a bunch of colleges that constitute the university. So these are like houses, different houses that you may belong as an academic as well as a student. I belong to one of these houses, one of these colleges. That's called Sydney Sussex College, and there I'm a fellow in economics. I spent most of my adult life in Sweden, not by design, but by a series of coincidences. I shouldn't call it a coincidence though. Let's call it cumulative probabilities that led me there. And then I ended up staying there for a very, very long period of time. And about a little over 3 years ago, I moved to the UK and started working here, and try to sort of keep myself engaged with the Swedish academic life by remaining as a fellow, remaining affiliated as a fellow to one of the institutes. They're also writing monthly columns, and I found it quite productive. I really hope to engage myself with the Turkish academia soon, now that I sort of started to see the end of my tenure. I think I will have some time and energy to allocate to my home country, where I'm from. So I'm Turkish, and I know most of you are also. What do I do? So from the description of what I do, or if you look at my CV, you may think that this is a messy open buffet. Here's somebody who could not decide what to work on and started working on a lot of things that are not related to one another. But the thing that ties all of the things that I work on is, again, space, but in particular spatial scale. So I'm very much interested in not what happens so much, but rather where it happens and on which geographical scale it happens. So the relationship between geography and economics to that end is the defining feature of pretty much everything I worked on so far and everything I'm planning to work on in the near future. I started my academic academic journey where I started working on geography of firms, mostly service firms, retailers, arts and entertainment establishments. So I was very much drawn to location of consumption. As an economist who studied economics in various places, we have this reductionist sometimes approach towards resource-based production, right? Everything is about holy trinity of land, labor, and capital. And there's a lot of work on how the production takes place, what are the productive means and its relationship with geography. But what I found really fascinating was that the location of consumption wasn't all that asked and answered. So there were several theories and empirical regularities that were identified in research, but there are still some ambiguities with regards to how we think about consumption in space. So I thought perhaps this is something I could work on. And over time, I grew to find local political preferences, peer effects at the neighborhood level quite interesting. Started doing some work on friends and neighbors voting, things like geography of discontent, which is pretty popular these days, as you may know. And yes, it's a cliche, I know, but I also worked on Brexit too. So those of you who are interested in geography of discontent, I'm available for further discussions or a chat or an informal chat whenever you guys want. the thing I worked on most over the past few years is ethnic enclaves and segregation. And most of what I will present to you today comes from a number of papers that are published or in progress, where we deal with microgeography of ethnic concentration and its implications for labor market integration of immigrants, basically. Mostly their introduction to labor market in the receiving country. And we mostly deal with forced migrants that took the decision to move to a particular country. In this case, it's Sweden, through some exogenous shock that they experienced in their home countries. So it's slightly different than the traditional migratory studies, migration studies that we see, where there's a rational individual who's trying to all the time optimize his or her location with respect to available resources. So this is push migration that we have been dealing with. And we only scratched the surface, particularly with regards to the empirics of it. And I'll try to show you some of the challenges we face on a daily basis when we're actually dealing with this problem. And I know this is going to be quite also familiar to some of you that are dealing with empirical problems as such that do not have much theoretical backing. I also landed a project on alternative food networks. I didn't start working on it yet, and I really am not sure what I'm going to do about it, but looking at sort of rural food networks, off-farm retail activities, and bed and breakfasts, and all of these entrepreneurial activities that take place in rural places. So this is an idea that I've been entertaining on my own, and I thought this can be something to look into, as there's a lot of potential there also for integration of immigrants, which is a bigger problem in rural or other more sparsely populated parts of many of the countries that receive these immigrants. I'm going to show you why that's actually a problem. So if you are familiar with this line of literature and you think I should know about something, please do ping me, send an email about it also. So I thought this is a good opportunity to ask for help also, not only talk about my existing work. I split up today's material into two parts. It's going to be a little bit messy. I had to shuffle together a lot of different things from a lot of different places. Some of them are from my traditional teaching. I teach urban and land economics, macroeconomy and housing economics, standard spatial economics at the graduate level, whatnot. But before talking about the actual topic, the microgeography of ethnic enclaves, I thought actually I should talk a little bit about the ABC of my literature, right? So what do we mean when we say spatial economics? How much it resembles with other computational social science realms, so to say. And if perhaps there's something that you will find useful there or interesting. And if it is redundant to those of you who are already familiar with this literature, I apologize in advance. I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional location theories, which is what I like to think about quite a lot. And empirical regularities in relation to regional hierarchy. So what we mean by regional hierarchy in space. Because all of these are quite important once we start crunching data, when we start thinking about how to organize the data, how to design an empirical setup, how to formulate a question in relation to space. And all of these actually come from 150 years almost old literature on traditional location theories that wasn't that empirical up until late 80s, early 90s. And with computational power, obviously, and availability of microdata, now we see excellent applications on these ideas. So I thought this can be an interesting area for some of you to look into. And one such topic to investigate within this context is, of course, ethnic enclaves and segregation, which is the second part of my presentation or lecture. So yeah, spatial economics. It's the coward's term, I say, spatial economics, because there are distinctly different sub-literatures within spatial science. Urban economists are standard economists, neoclassical economists that are trying to sort of make the use of geography in economic modeling more mainstream by way of taking most of what is already available in mainstream econ literature and introducing the element of space. And then there are regional economists. These people are more interested in the interaction between different localities, may them be cities or regions. They sometimes get along well and sometimes don't get along well so much. And then there are planners and urban sociologists. They are within the urban and regional science realm. They also ask similar questions, but often methodologically differ from rest of us. And the reason why I called it the coward's term, spatial economics, is for people like me. I don't necessarily feel like I belong to a particular camp. Some of the work that I do is softer than others from an economist's point of view. And I do religiously read qualitative work and sociological work on space. Some studies on old school development economics and economic history I find extremely useful for identifying, for example, path-dependent events in space. So to that end, spatial economics is a more welcoming and inclusive term that I choose to use often. The idea comes from, so the idea comes from the fact that population and economic activity is extremely unevenly distributed across space. These disparities are very large and they're also quite persistent. And these empirical regularities, I mean, they are empirical regularities to the extent that they don't happen random, right? So we see a bunch of determinants to be rather uniformly or rather we see a bunch of determinants that can quite uniformly explain the disparities that we observe in space with regards to population and all sorts of economic activity in different countries, in different cities, whatnot. And the thing that is quite interesting in this line of thinking is the spatial hierarchy or regional hierarchy, the way we think about it. So we have administrative borders, administrative geographies, such as the nation, or territories that are defined through some historical process like regions. These are sort of units of observation that is easier to find data for and often therefore subject to empirical studies. But what I'm really interested in is what's happening underneath these units of observations, these spatial aggregation level. Such as the cities and the neighborhoods, or even blocks, grids within the neighborhoods. So really small, fine-grain geographical scale is something that I'm extremely drawn to. And this is the line of, or this is the corner of the literature that's growing fastest. And we have obviously, once again, our computational power to thank to and the availability of data that probably couldn't even be imagined some 30 years ago. That the kind of data we work with today is pretty spectacular to answer some of the questions that could only be hypothesized a few decades ago. This urban economics, regional economics literature has its roots in the ideas around urbanism. Jane Jacobs will be familiar to perhaps some of you who are interested in cities and the way cities function. She wasn't even an academic, actually. She was an urban thinker, and I believe one of the most influential urban thinkers of our times, an activist who really fought the planners of her time who were trying to sort of implement mega projects in New York, trying to split the naturally emergent ways of urban life, so to say. And she argues that what really makes cities quite interesting and special for creative thought and anonymity is the way they naturally emerge. So that there's this order without design kind of idea that she talks sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly. There's one book I very strongly recommend. That's The Death and Life of Great American Cities from the 60s that she wrote. It's a phenomenal piece that discusses these issues, how to think about city life, how to think about urban life. So why cities are incredibly attractive places, but how we can also destroy them by sometimes over planning. And this is an interesting quote that I use when I teach to my first year land econ students. Nations are political and military entities, and so are blocks of nations, but it doesn't necessarily follow from this that they're also the basic salient entities of economic life, or that they're particularly useful for probing the mysteries of economic structure, the reasons for rise and decline of wealth. So most of the questions we ask in economics or in relation to economy, they don't actually rely on these national borders. Some things that we observe at the national scale may not even be completely accurate if you think about the ecological fallacies and some of the issues around aggregation, right? Averages can be quite misleading, and we see a lot of spatial variation at various spatial scales that can reveal information that we are quite blind to. And this is the kind of argument that is at the core of, I would say, the spatial economics literature, or the ideas around spatial hierarchy. It is quite interesting when we look at the historical side of things also. There are a lot of development economists that are studying structural shifts in several societies, and they talk about this hockey stick of human prosperity following industrial revolution, right? So nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and all of a sudden something happens everywhere. Well, not at the same time, obviously, which is the main determinant of our understanding of the power relationships between the core and the periphery, which is a completely different topic. We could discuss about that for 5 hours alone, but we see that despite the challenges that are associated with the industrialization or the era of industrialization, there's an enormous increase in human prosperity across the globe following this particular structural change. And an interesting, of course, aspect of it is that when we look at urban population, it is almost identical to what we see with any other economic indicator that we investigate in relation to industrialization, basically industrial revolution. This is sometimes discussed in a very causal fashion that, okay, so industrialization required agglomeration of people and resources, hence the cities became more important, and people were drawn to these factories that were initially placed in the heart of these old industrial cities, and therefore we saw the increase in urban population. But the more plausible and more fair explanation, I believe, is that there's a mutual causality between industrialization or most of the innovations that took place during that period and the rise in urban population. Because urban population is quite important in terms of democratization of ideas too, right? Deja McCloskey talks a lot about this in her studies of bourgeois rhetorics, basically. So how you didn't need to be an estate owner to be an entrepreneur during a certain period in time. That urban life gave you a certain degree of anonymity and the possibility to sort of take risks that weren't available to you in a smaller, more tightly knit, thick social capital environment in a village or in a sparsely populated area. So yes, it's true that industrial revolution perhaps kickstarted this urbanism trend that we have observed, but in return, urban population, clustering of all sorts of people from all sorts of lives, in return also fed into the industrialization process rather dramatically, the way we see how the empirics of this works. And of course, it came with 1 million challenges in relation to quality of life and inequality. But that's the empirical part that I would like to talk about a little later today, if you may allow me, actually. So this is just the general sort of historical backdrop of what we see in the literature. One interesting empirical regularity that we observe is that urbanization or urban population is highly correlated with income. And we should take this with a pinch of salt, obviously. Again, once we talk about income, it entails a lot of things. But even if you just look at wage income, living cost adjusted wage income even, we see that the density at an urban scale, at the city level, is highly related to the marginal product of labor for the people that we see in these urban spaces. And in an interesting way, we see this almost happening in fractals. So those of you who are interested in the maths bit of it, it's very interesting to see how this thing scales at different geographical aggregations. The same relationship holds at the regional level, at the city level, at the neighborhood level, even at the block level. So the denser the area is, higher the income levels are as an empirical regularity. Most of the literature, most of the empirical literature since the 90s in spatial economics, both in urban and regional economics, is sort of trying to peel off this empirical regularity. They're trying to understand where we observe this empirical regularity strongest. Why do we observe this empirical regularity? What are the mechanisms through which such empirical regularity may emerge? So it's an empirical sort of battle to get the best answer, the better answer. It's a quantitative battlefield, so to say, that there's always an improvement one can present to sort of understand this particular empirical regularity. But this empirical regularity is again a very important part of this line of literature. So dense areas seem to be doing better in terms of the overall economic production and productivity. We have some quite reasonable explanations for why that may be the case, and some other explanations are not all that obvious to us. And those non-obvious, more tacit explanations are also more difficult to measure, right? Quantification of them are far more troubling. Finding data for them is far more troubling, and also coming up with empirical designs to isolate mechanisms related to those not so obvious mechanisms is what is actually the fun part of the empirical literature on this issue. And as an extension to this, if some places grow, that means other places must be declining. As it is the case with most of Europe, in Sweden, we have seen in 290 administrative units we have, which is the equivalent of a city, what you would call a city in a country. But these are not two urban places altogether, but they are the smallest level of government. So the most local level of governance you observe, so to say. More than 200 of these 290 municipal localities, for example, declined in absolute population over the period where we have seen this rise in urbanization, which meant a lot of structural problems in relation to distribution of wealth and resources, and in return, political discontent again, and polarization at the country level. So it's a very interesting, actually, process to observe. Some of the administrative definitions we have for what a place is or what a locality is almost redundant in some European countries today. So places that we call cities are no longer cities, and it's very difficult to actually talk about this. Sometimes I'm invited by some of these municipalities to talk about urban trends, and you are talking to a bunch of people whose jobs depend on the existence of these local structures, these governance structures, and you're pretty much telling them, look, actually this administrative unit may be altogether redundant, so that there's some perhaps need for consolidation. It's not a very popular position to take, but we know that this is an empirical problem, much more than a political problem, actually. So what we call what we deem to be a city is not a static is not a static game, right? That it changes over time. So what we called a city 100 years ago is dramatically different than what we consider to be an urban space today. So it's important to keep this in mind, that there's some political heat around this. A lot of countries are doing this leveling up schemes, like the UK. In Sweden, they had this idea of Hela Sverige ska leva, all of the Sweden is going to live. It's a big government project and initiative that sort of was designed to make sure that none of these places died in this process, basically. And obviously, it's a bit problematic to accept that not all of these places can survive. I have to be cautious of time, and I don't want to bore you so much. By the way, you guys are most welcome to interrupt me at any time. I don't mind this to be conversational at all. Again, I know it's going to be redundant for some of you, but if you are not familiar with something I mentioned and need further explanation, you're most welcome to just interrupt. So there are a bunch of assumptions. Welcome to the world of assumptions. There are a bunch of assumptions that we operate on, obviously, in spatial economics. As much as it is not entirely mainstream econ, we still have a departure point, certain axioms that we operate with. But a couple of considerations are more reasonable than others, and I had a sort of a positive selection of those things in this presentation. This part alone could be 7-8 lectures, sort of discussing about the basic premises for studying space and economics together, so geography and economics together. But the first thing and the most important thing is, of course, unit of reference. And this is something we, all of us, I believe here, struggle with a lot, right? So that you have a raw data and the data is codified in a certain fashion. If we are lucky enough, it's perfectly point coded, geocoded, so that we can play however we want. But sometimes this data, of course, comes at a certain spatial scale. It's often an administrative unit. Again, when we say a neighborhood, it's neighborhood defined by some authority. When we say a city, it's city defined by some authority, and so on. And if you are actually doing work across countries, so if you're comparing different countries with one another, which is a game I respect a lot and I don't meddle with too much myself because I'm lazy. I respect you guys a lot because so you have data at the city level from 30 different countries. What is a city in one is not necessarily comparable to what you deem to be a city in another, right? But you have to somehow make it work. And then comes the magician's hat, and we sort of try to sort of make these things as comparable as possible by all sorts of tricks. Unit of reference is extremely important, even before we start thinking about how to clean the data, how to crunch the numbers, but when we are formulating the question itself. So we have to always start from a point where we ask, which geography? Is it the regions that we're studying, cities or neighborhoods? If so, what kind of variables I need at these particular spatial aggregations? And the other thing that is quite fascinating about this literature, which you are going to find quite silly if you don't come from economics. In economics 101, we start learning about immobile people and immobile capital. We often deal with the general equilibrium framework. The thing that is quite useful, I believe, in the spatial economics literature is that these assumptions are stretched a lot. Of course, everything is about spatial equilibrium. So not only the models, theoretical models, and the empirical work recognize the mobility of people and capital, but the entire empirical application often is built around the fact that these things are mobile. It is not only controlling for their mobility, but building the empirical design around their mobility, which means also that the kind of data we need to work with is quite different than the kind of data an ordinary macroeconomist, for example, would require in his or her empirical analysis. The other aspect that is highlighted quite a lot in this line of literature is the nature versus man-made amenities. You can think this in terms of first nature versus second nature causes of spatial inequality. This is a topic that is discussed a lot in development economics literature too, right? So we have a geography, again, whichever spatial scale you have in mind. It can be a region or a country. There are a number of characteristics we observe. Some of these things are quite innate. They don't vary over time, or they vary over time very, very incrementally so, right? They don't vary over time. What I mean by these first nature geography, first nature geographical elements of space, mountains and the climate, which changes rather gradually, religion, language, distance to other places. If you have a city, distance to coast, perhaps, certain natural resources, things that are quite sticky in place that change perhaps, but in a very long time, so that if you are running an analysis for 10, 15 years, you wouldn't observe any change. Hence, you can sort of treat these things as almost time invariant. And then we have a bunch of things that are man-made. So because of these particular characteristics, these first nature geographical characteristics of these places, they attract people and they attract not so random bunch of people, right? That there's a sorting happening all the time. Depending on the characteristics we have in place, we see different people sorting themselves into different environments. And depending on the cohort we observe in a particular place, we also see the emergence of the creation of other features, other characteristics. Sometimes we talk about this in the context of amenities, but it can very well be disamenities too, right? That these people don't always produce nice things. Sometimes they may end up producing things that make the place quite repellent, sort of tipping the way equilibrium works. And all of a sudden you see a shrinkage of some sorts. And that's also quite relevant for our understanding of spatial equilibrium, because places do not infinitely grow. We observe, for example, stagnation in growth quite often these days, and even some shrinkage in places that we never imagined we would see before in some of the major cities, sort of not only a slowing down of urbanization, but the trends sort of reversing even. So this is discussed in relation to pull versus push factors, basically. So if people, if place dictates who lives there, may that be city or region again, and in return, people change the nature of the place, this is going to create a sort of an equilibrium between the pull and the push factors. Sometimes they're referred as centripetal and centrifugal forces in relation to agglomeration of people in a particular location. This is discussed in the context of urban agglomeration quite a lot. So you have a bunch of people, you have another million people moving into a city, hypothetically speaking, through some exogenous shock, let's say. Some things will change due to this increase in population, right? And some of these things are going to add to the attractiveness of this environment, and some of these things are going to add to the problems associated with this environment that we would consider push factors. So this this equilibrium between the pull and the push factors is subject to empirical work quite a lot. What we mean by agglomeration externalities when we talk about agglomeration externalities. I wonder if you guys are familiar with the concept of agglomeration. So when we talk about agglomeration, we don't just head count people, right? It's not just sheer size. It needs to be also dense. So if you have some spatial delimited area, some border that is provided to you or that you chose to work with, it is the density of economic activity. It's the density of people that we observe in this environment. There are all sorts of tricks to capture this, several spatial concentration indices that one can use. The way I like to do it is the most simple way, is that I actually look at sort of a per square foot, per square kilometer number of people to have some of these empirical problems to be eliminated. I will spend a couple of minutes on this, what I mean by this soon. But when I say agglomeration, I mean clustering of co-clustering of people and other economic entities in a particular geographical level, basically. And this is not well, this is not new, as it is not as it is the case with most of the things that we deal with. Everything is an iteration of something that is said, and in this case, it is it's a pretty old idea that was initially formalized in the context of economics, at the very least, by Alfred Marshall. And in a way, I can be challenged on this statement, obviously, but if you think about him as sort of a neoclassical sort of mainstream economist, probably Marshall is one of the first economists as such. He comes from maths background, and I don't know if he did a good job by doing that, but he introduced the use of maths into economics. He's an important contributor to that game, essentially, although he has some ideas around when mathematics is useful in economic thought. And I don't think he would be extremely happy with the state of literature if he saw it now, but I can share some of his quotes in his personal correspondence with some of the friends, because he thinks it's a good common language, but if you're not able to actually explain it with real world examples, you should burn the math. He says, he literally uses this term, burn the math if you are not able to provide an empirical evidence for it, which is not stated in the textbooks so much as you may imagine. But he's the first person to think about these agglomerations, but in a way that is very, again, production oriented, right? He talks a lot about localization economies, and by localization we mean you talk about an era where industrialization is at its height, at its peak. So you see these clustering of factories that are producing same or similar stuff within the same locations. It's not the urbanism that Jane Jacobs talks about, but it is more industrial co-location, industrial clustering during this period, sort of late 1800s, early 1900s observations these are. And he's the first person to talk about how such clustering, such agglomeration may bring some positive externalities, basically. And some of these things are quite easy to describe, again, such as sharing of the resources available to you within a certain proximity. If you are operating within the same industry, the kind of resources that you would need, may then be infrastructure or natural resources, or in today's world, business services. It will be easier for you to access these things if you are a critical mass of agents that have the same or similar demand for these things, right? But some of the things that he talks about, that's pointing at, for example, things like the learning mechanism, so how you get inspired by the work of others, agents within the same cluster. These things, he says, they are more like in the air. They are very tacit externalities. They are things that are good about being in a cluster that is not as obvious, hence not as easy to capture and quantify. Of course, there are many others that worked around these issues. One that is, I think, understated, that deserves far more credit, is Mark Jefferson, who worked a lot with the law of the primate city, so that they worked a lot with rank size distribution, just observing the empirical regularities across different cities, how they grow and shrink, their just sheer population sometimes. And what they find is that in some countries, there's an empirical regularity where the largest city is twice as large as the second largest city, 3 times larger than the third largest city, and so on. So that kind of rank size distribution is quite interesting, because biologists use it for species and taxonomy, for example. If you look at linguists, it's a known empirical regularity across different languages in terms of the frequency of use of a particular word. So it's almost a naturally emergent phenomena that we observe also in cities, and the way city size presents itself if we are to sort of rank order them with respect to their population. But he identifies that in some places we see the largest city to be much, much, much larger than the second largest city, which he calls a primate city. So that this excessive clustering of people, excessive clustering of economic agents in particular cities. London is a good example. Obviously, Istanbul is a very, very good example for a place as such. I'm not going to spend more time on it, but there were a bunch of people, not all of them were economists, that sort of thought about these ideas at the sort of turn of the century. So again, I am trying to squeeze in hours and hours of lecture material into something and presenting to you as a teaser. If any of you think that this can be useful for you, I'm happy to share my lecture notes from a number of modules that I'm running, or discuss with you further later in an informal fashion, if you are doing any empirical work that you think can benefit from these things. But just to mention a couple of the important concepts that we deal with. So first, we have increasing returns to scale, right? So why do we observe agglomeration externalities? It has a lot to do with the fact that 1 + 1 is not always equal to 2 when it comes to increasing returns to scale. And that's mostly because of indivisibilities. This idea is discussed in the context of a factory. Adam Smith talks a lot about indivisible structures and how specialization is important for productive production system. But cities can be also discussed in a similar fashion, is the argument here. That city is almost like a machine, and that there are certain indivisibilities that we observe in the city. So some of the infrastructure, for example, we have, thanks to the critical mass of people living there, this is not something that is divisible, right? The arts and entertainment we find in urban environment, for example, is very, very indivisible to that end. Some of the culture that we observe in cities, the way of life we observe in cities. So pretty much everything that you observe in cities that is dependent on this critical mass of population, it resembles a lot with over-specialization or excessive specialization that we would need in a productive production system in modern world, right? It's this PIM factory example. So you have a pen, and the guy that can do the cap cannot do the ink, but everything comes together in a very productive fashion thanks to this increasing returns to scale argument. A city is much like that, so that everybody has a specialization and able to contribute to this machine in a way that by being in close proximity, you get to enjoy the benefits from it, even though you may not take part in the production of that particular thing directly. which is completely different than this agrarian setup that we have seen for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to the peak of urbanization, basically. And the other concept is externalities. I believe this is going to be a far more familiar concept to those of you. So in a way, this is essentially what we talk about when we talk about neighborhood effects. As a third agent, how are you experiencing the interaction between two other agents? And these can be firms, these can be individuals. But the argument here, the spatial argument here, is that in order for you to be affected by a transaction, and a non-monetary transaction often happening, you need to be in close proximity. And this effect can be a positive effect, it can be a negative effect, obviously. In the context of crime and neighborhoods, I've seen that somebody is actually doing some work on crime among the group. Probably you will be familiar with that sort of strand of literature. It's not always jolly good. Sometimes these effects are negative and sometimes they're positive, but the requirement is that you need to be sufficiently close to this transaction to be influenced by it, and hence comes the idea of agglomeration. So taking these two things, then there are tens of explanations for why cities exist. And if there's an economic historian or an urban sociologist among you, probably you guys will feel like throwing a stone or two to my head. But the way economists approach this issue, urban and regional economists, is that there are three mechanisms that make cities extremely important and attractive, and they call this microfoundation of agglomeration, basically. So these agglomeration externalities that we talk about, if we think about cities as these horrible, horrible places, in that case, the push factors should overrule, should offset the benefits from agglomeration. Hence, we should see a shrinkage. And if we don't see as such a trend, there must be sort of a trend that favors things that are beneficial about these agglomerations. This is the very reductionist, very crude idea that they depart from. But these three mechanisms in particular are discussed a lot, and these are the three microfoundations of agglomeration externalities. They are sharing, matching, and learning, and I want to spend some minutes on what I mean by these three mechanisms. These are what we call centrifugal forces, things that draw you to an environment, a dense environment, despite the fact that you may come up with 10 to 15 things that you hate about the city. Why do you end up being in city, or why are you forced sometimes to be in city, be in the city? So these three mechanisms are discussed a lot in relation to that. And in a way, I managed to find this image, and this is being recorded. Let me put a note somewhere where I don't remember where I found the image, and probably it's noted somewhere. But these three mechanisms, they don't necessarily operate at the same spatial scale either, and that's quite important for what I will present later in relation to ethnic enclaves and segregation too. So that's the part that I think is going to be quite interesting to those of you who like to do the empirics, basically. So think about the data, how to organize the data, how to run the things. But let me first talk very briefly about these three mechanisms and see if you think they are as interesting as I thought they were the first time I got to know about them. So the first one is sharing. Sharing is caring. So sharing is a very, very important mechanism in agglomeration externalities. Here, there's a good painting I found from Fra Carnevale. This is the depiction of an ideal city. It's an hypothetical city that has all of these things that you would get to enjoy if you are in a city. You have the entertainment provided to you in the Colosseum. You have the courts. There's some justice, some infrastructure for justice. There's a nice square for people to gather in a perhaps spontaneous fashion, sort of this public space that is available to you that may not be available if you don't have the critical mass. And you have all these structures around you. So it's very, very infrastructure oriented idea, sharing. But actually Sharing can also apply to sharing of a labor pool. If you are starting a business and you believe that you are going to need a specific type of skill set, it's much easier to sort of tap on the resources available to you in a larger labor market. And sharing can also be about sharing of, again, more difficult to observe and quantify type of things, such as the culture and the know-how and sort of this more immaterial structures that you find in cities. So they argue that for this you need, it's almost like an S-shaped curve, a Sigmoidian curve is depicted here, that in order for you to experience benefits from sharing, you need to have, again, a critical mass of people in an area, and then the probability of you being able to jointly build and finance, make it feasible financially to have most of these structures will increase with the number of people moving in, right? But it's not a linear relationship that you would reach a point beyond which an additional member to the club, it's very much economics of club kind of idea, right? An additional member to the club may not necessarily bring additional benefits. So that's about what you would consider to be the optimal city size. And in some cases, the argument is that it is way worse than a Sigmoidian curve, that you may observe something like an inverse U shape, right? That an additional member to the club may actually create some crowding out effect, that you may grow beyond the optimal size for this kind of sharing benefits to be experienced in an urban space or even in a neighborhood, depending on which geographical scale you work with. The second one is matching. Here again, there's a painting that I find quite amusing from Maddox Brown. This is like a job market extravaganza in the old times where you didn't have the online recruitment mechanisms. You would go to a place, I mean, you see these in the old Turkish movies also, that if you're a jobless guy, you wake up in the morning and you walk to the market and you hope that somebody's going to pick you to do some manual labor of some sort. It's sort of that kind of life is depicted here in this painting. And the idea here is that agglomerations also allow for people to experience a better match between the employers and employees in different spatial environments. Often cities and regions are discussed in this context. Not only the probability of a match is improved by scale, but also the quality of the match is improved, is the idea. So that there are also these matching models applied not only for the relationship between or matching between the employer and the employees, but in real estate, for example, if you are searching for a home, similar models are applied there. There are some marriage market studies that look into mating strategies in different environments that use similar matching models. So all sorts of applications are available for matching, and how matching is influenced by scale, basically. So a better match can be a higher probability of a match between two parties, or also a better quality of a match. And finally, and the one that I find most interesting, I think, is the learning mechanism. And here comes another painting by Raphael. It's the School of Athens, depicting all sorts of philosophers that did not live necessarily during the same period. But here the idea is that, so if you have a creative, an open debate environment that allow people to bump into each other in a serendipitous fashion and exchange ideas, sort of you have this playground for people to interact with one another, you will have all sorts of returns to this, these interactions. And by being in close proximity to these environments, you would benefit from the positive externalities associated with it. I think modern day universities are quite good examples to this. I know there are so many empirical applications, for example, that look at the propensity of two people writing a paper together, with respect to distance between their offices, and they find quite interesting results for even spatial proximity within the same building, let alone the same city or neighborhood, that I can share with you if you guys are interested in this. They look at patent applications and geographical proximity and all sorts of stuff. Sort of, it's a more codifiable version of this semi-biblical depiction of what we may consider learning mechanism to be. So that you need the critical mass of people again in an environment. You should be able to bump into each other, talk about things, and exchange ideas, and all sorts of things can happen. If we could, for example, leave today and go to a pub, probably we would experience something similar. But this virtual way of doing things, unfortunately, do not permit for that kind of exchanges so much the way I feel it. I don't know what you guys think, but all of this, why is it useful? I'm going to wrap up this part, I promise, if you're bored by it, but I think this is the interesting bit. All of this dates back to an idea around a system of hierarchy or order without design, so that there are traditional location theories that look at the early settlement of humankind pretty much, and they observe certain empirical regularities for how they settled. And an interesting fact is that if you look at cities that are not excessively planned, we see the emergence of cities in a very, very similar fashion, so that there is almost this innate idea that is embedded in us that leads us to use space, whatever space we have, in a certain fashion, right? So how we partition space for different economic activities, how we position ourselves in geography, it's very similar to the way bees create their hives is the idea. So cities are depicted in this line of literature or in these models in a hexagonal shape, and I'll show you why. And the reason why bees love hexagons, of course, it's because it's very efficient and it's far more durable. And probably through evolutionary process, this proved itself to be the most useful shape for them to store their produce. And when we look at the cities, all cities, cities that historically emerged, we see some similar spatial arrangements, some empirical regularities around it at the very least. That there exists an hierarchical spatial arrangement between major centers, sub-centers, and residential areas. That if you have, for example, an urban core, that is an all-encompassing market area that nests multiple smaller areas within. And an interesting aspect of this is that central locations are far more connected to one another than these sub-centers. So I always give this example to my students that it's much easier to get from Cambridge to London, central London, for example, than some of the villages nearby, right? All of the infrastructure follows sort of this commuting patterns and other types of interactions that happen between major centers. And these places are spatially encompassing the smaller areas or hierarchically lower ranked sub-centers. And the reason why we see this hexagonal shape in, again, less and less so because of obviously modern day planning practices, but why we see them in historical cities is that imagine the way we work with spatial data. What do we do most of the time? We pick a buffer zone, right? It's the easiest thing to work with, so that you identify a distance from a centroid. So you draw a circle around it and you say, I'm going to look at what's happening in here. But in reality, these buffer zones, they overlap with one another, right? I mean, we have to allow for them to overlap with one another, because if we assume them to be tangent to one another, there would be all sorts of places that are not catered by any of the services. Maybe those services be market oriented or even, you know, government services, whatnot. And once you allow for actually overlapping circles, overlapping, let's call buffer zones, what you end up with, if you actually draw lines through the intersections of these points, is an hexagonal shape. It's quite fascinating in a way that when you look at ancient Mayan settlements, for example, you see a similar arrangement. And there are some studies that find or that predict the location of forgotten cities or lost cities, they call it in the archaeological work, by looking at the places that they know the location of, so that they use the central place theory approach quite a lot in empirical archaeology or in archaeology work, which I thought was an interesting thing to bring up, actually. And following this idea, a long tradition of economics literature as well as spatial literature, of course, looked into urban land rents. So if we have this kind of spatially hierarchical arrangement between city centers and towns and residential areas, there should also be a way of identifying the willingness of people to pay for land at different distance spans, right? Or with respect to proximity to the core of a particular market. And that will depend on a number of things, depending on, for example, what we talk about. Is it a residential or a urban land rent, or is it land rent for offices, or is it for manufacturing? What you need, your requirements for proximity will differ dramatically, hence the kind of price you are willing to put on proximity will change dramatically. The idea was introduced in a very sort of, Brits have this long history of estate ownership. Everything is about the land fertility, land ownership, sort of in the agricultural context. This was about the land and its fertility, but it's a very easy to apply notion even in the modern world. So if you look at, for example, a bid rent model for urban land use, it follows the exact same thing I showed a second ago, the central place theory that is introduced by the German school in the 1800s. Fontanen himself was a landowner, which could be classified as this member of the theory of leisure class, had a lot of time and money to sit and think about the spatial distribution of economic activities across space, and realize that a lot of things that are more perishable are produced closer to the city center, because you need to go to the city center more often to sell these things. And if you have something slightly less perishable, you can then be at the outskirts of the city because you don't have to commute to the city center as often. And so that there exists some relationship between the order of goods that are being produced in different farmland and their proximity to the city center. So what would be the equivalent of this in modern time? The kind of economic activities that require more face-to-face interaction, then will have a higher willingness to pay to be in the city center. And if you are a factory that do not necessarily require that kind of intensive interaction, you may then choose to actually be located at the outskirts of the city, so that we observe this kind of spatial arrangement of economic activities following the same idea. And if you look at how this would look for example, the office sector, which is the reason why we see the building height we see in central business districts, right? That there exists a huge factor substitution. Land is so scarce, and you really rely on these intensive interactions for a number of reasons, particularly and mostly for learning mechanism. This can be mimicking, stealing ideas, stealing employees, stealing customers, whatever, really, that you need to be there, which is an idea that will probably be challenged if you go through a structural change after a shock like this one. But these things persist quite a lot, so the change is not going to happen too fast. But this is practically why we see the requirement for building height in central business districts in larger cities. This is what it looks like for the manufacturing sector. Either you prefer to be very much in the center, or you want to be at the outskirts, so that your willingness to pay to be somewhat near the urban center diminishes, attenuates rather sharply with the distance. And this is what it looks like for the residential preferences. So you really want to be in the center, or you choose to be at the suburbs if you have a preference for larger space. So this kind of bifurcation you observe for the sorting of individuals for their residential purposes. So it's a pretty interesting application if you think about it. So what I'm going to do is that I am going to stop for 5 minutes, if that's all right with you, and start talking about the empirics of this, show you a case, and then I hope that we can have a little bit of a brainstorming session altogether, which allows us to interact with one another, hopefully. Would that be an acceptable arrangement?
Yeah, Hocam, do you want to take a break maybe, or do you want to take a break later?
I can, that's what I mean. I mean, we can take a break for about 5 minutes now, just fill up our coffee mugs and come back, and then I can start.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take like about a 5-minute break, and then
should I create an?
There.
Breakout rooms?
Before the breakout rooms, I'm going to show one empirical case and sort of try to explain how we did it, and hopefully we will then discuss how it could be done, if that's all right. Play slideshow. All right. So we said there are these mechanisms, right? And they're not the only mechanisms through which cities emerge. By no means. Don't think that we, or I, or anybody around me is silly enough to believe that only because of these three mechanisms cities tend to be. But one thing that we are extremely interested enough, we are extremely interested in is this face-to-face interaction bit, like so the social interaction, spontaneous interaction that takes place in dense environments. And an interesting aspect of it is that it's often discussed at the city level, but I would like to think, as it is with so many of my colleagues, that these things happen at a much smaller spatial scale, right? City is too big to talk about how we can benefit from the sort of the propensity to be near other people. Perhaps it's the neighborhood. Perhaps it's even much smaller than that. And that precise idea is investigated by a rather big body of literature. The attenuation of learning externalities or these interaction externalities by distance. So how local are these spatial density externalities are. The things that we associate with in the theoretical work or in many of these academic debates, the things that we associated with the city, perhaps do not necessarily operate at the city level. Perhaps we should look at a much smaller spatial scale is the hunch most people had, and they started doing interesting empirical work on it not more than 10 years ago, basically. So it's like 10, 12 years old empirical work on it. There's microgeography of these things. I'm not going to repeat myself too much here, but the basic idea here that you have certain level of density that is available to you in different places. I'll send these slides also to all of you. You can play with different cities to see how these density externalities may look different at different environments. You can build only so much due to some height restrictions in some of the cities, of course. And there are even further restrictions to density, such as green belt policies, whatnot, right? So density is a heavily controlled phenomenon in most of the cities, and not enough in some other cities. So that's also a part of another debate. But how do we measure how people may be benefiting from these density externalities, particularly in relation to face-to-face interaction? There's an interesting strand of literature on this that is called urban wage premium. So I showed you early on how the urban density is heavily correlated with income level in pretty much anywhere we look at, in all sorts of countries and all sorts of cities, and even at smaller spatial scales. This was first documented by Adna Weber in late 19th century, but the first empirical work is, proper empirical work, I would say, is as late as early 2000s. Glaser and Murray, I don't know if you're familiar with Edward Glaser. He's the kind of economist who writes a paper about everything. So this is one thing that he worked a lot on, spatial density externalities. They find, for example, 33% urban wage premium for the United States. So if you double that's an elasticity. So if you double the urban size, you find 33% higher wages. It's very difficult to attribute all of this to productivity, obviously, and their estimations are not causal at all. So this is an empirical regularity that they observe. Similar findings, Combe et al. Finds for the French cities, where they see, for example, that the average wage in Paris is 15% higher than other large French cities and as much as 60% higher than in rural areas. And there are a bunch of other papers that do almost like replication studies for different countries, looking at the relationship between urban population and income. So obvious problem here is that it's not random bunch of people that sort themselves into cities. Is it the cities that make these people more productive, or do more productive people sort themselves into cities? How much of it is cost adjusted? If we control for these things around sorting and selection, do we really find these large numbers for urban wage premium. So is the density premium is as large as it is stated in these earlier empirical work that look at the city level density and related to city level wages. But another aspect of it, of course, is whether this is a far more localized effect than we would like to think or than we thought in the literature initially. So perhaps it's not necessarily that, perhaps it's not necessarily the density at the city level that we should care about, but it should be some other spatial scale we should look into, such as the neighborhood. And there's a very interesting paper I'd like to present here. It's not my own paper. It's a paper by 3 of my colleagues from Sweden. We were lucky enough to have access to the Swedish registry microdata that you may all be familiar with. This is like the best data in the whole world if you are working with econometrics, if you are after predictive modeling, let's say. That is a full population register data available to you at the individual establishment and firm level. But the nice thing about it was that in when about I was starting my PhD, the SCB, Statistics Sweden, made it available to people in a geocoded format that covered all of the observations from 1992 onwards, basically. So we could pin down every individual, where they live and where they work, down to 250 by 250 meter grids. That was a fascinating thing to do. Because that meant that some of these questions that are traditionally asked and answered at the urban scale could then be explored at smaller spatial environments. And we had they, in this particular paper, had a very good reason to believe that in order for you to actually benefit from the sheer presence of other people around you, you need to be really, really close to them. So it's not sufficient for you to be nested within the same city, to be in the same city, but perhaps you should be in the same neighborhood or even in the same grid. And the idea here is that if you look at the building heights, pick any map, for example, of a city, you see that the building height attenuates extremely sharply as you move away from the central business district, right? Exactly the way we see in most of these maps. So for offices, we said that there's this huge preference to be located at the core of the central business district, but within something like 15 to 20 minutes away from it, your willingness to pay extra to be close to this area diminishes very sharply. So you value proximity quite a lot. And human interaction is a little similar. That being in the same city may not necessarily mean much, but maybe you really need to be within the same block or even within the same building. There were similar studies that looked at Madison Avenue advertisement companies and saw how, for example, they benefited from being close to one another and the sort of benefits that they derived from this kind of proximity diminished within a few kilometers distance to Manhattan. So they explored this idea using the Swedish data, and what they do is that they look at the willingness to commute. So first of all, in the Swedish context, and it may be different in different places, but there's some regularity that shows 1 hour, 40 minutes to 1 hour time is an important sort of time mark for people's willingness to commute. That's beyond 40 minutes, the willingness to commute attenuates rather sharply, so that there is this preference for mobility within a certain distance. I believe other colleagues may have talked about commuting behavior in particular and how you can actually work this out with different types of data. In our case, it's quite easy to do that. You can either, again, pin down the individual at his or her residential address, and we know exactly where he or she works. So you can calculate the distance between these two locations, which would give you the commuting distance, right? You don't even need to rely on these administrative boundaries. And you can do that as crow flies using some Euclidean distance, or if you're using some open source roadmap, you can calculate the distances and time distances by looking at different means of transportation to see how long it takes to get from one point to another. If you are working with so small spatial environments, then the kind of spatial weight matrices you end up with, they're enormous. So it's a very computationally challenging thing to do, of course. In this particular case, they just wanted to make the point that they wanted to show the attenuation of density externalities with distance. So they went with Euclidean distance, basically. But in the context of Sweden, also distance as crow flies correlates something like 0.87 with driving distances. And so there's a very high correlation between different types of distances that you may choose to work with. So using these geocoded data, so using the geocode, you can actually partition then your data into these tiny, tiny grids, right? I'd like to think they are about a block in the American context. So these are very walkable areas. And they create first order neighbors, and second order neighbors for a particular observation they have. That's the individual in one of these grids. So then you can take the same approach that the literature had, estimating wage against density and controlling for a bunch of individual characteristics, of course, that are traditionally associated with wage levels. So that is very standard Minserian wage equation. So what determines wage, education, age, all sorts of individual characteristics that you control for. And in addition to these things, how does your environment influence your level of productivity captured by wage differentials, let's say. So they repeat the exercise that was available in the literature, but at different spatial scales. So they look at the density at the neighborhood level, density at the second order neighbors, sort of these grids around where you live, and the density in the overall city, right? And their hypothesis is that the elasticities that they would obtain, representing the importance of density for wages, should be much higher at the very, very proximate environment, at the very grid that you live in. And that this kind of effect should attenuate as you move away, right? This is what they predict to find. And this is indeed what they find. I don't know how familiar you guys are with econometrics. Am I boring you with I try to have as few of these as possible, but I know you do way cooler data stuff than standard econometric modeling probably, but here what they have is a standard empirical setup. They run some OLS regressions. These are pooled OLS, and then they have some individual fixed effects. So they observe what does an individual fixed effects there mean is that they observe people that move only, right? So that if your location is fixed over time, then you wouldn't be there basically. Or do they have the fixed effects? I'm sorry, I actually made a mistake. So they have a fixed effects at the neighborhood level. So characteristics of the neighborhood other than density itself is controlled for that do not vary over time. So what they observe is the changes in density basically. And an interesting thing that they find is that most of what you can attribute to density externalities, so density making you more productive or density being associated with your productivity level, is captured by the neighborhood level density. You see some positive association between density at the second order, first order and second order neighbors to where you live, but not nearly as high of a magnitude as you observe with the very place that you are working. So face-to-face interactions are incredibly localized. Most of what we attribute to urban density is actually operating at the neighborhood level, or even smaller than the neighborhood itself is what they find. And that you can see from the fact that the magnitude for the coefficient for the first variable, that's neighborhood density, is nearly 10 times larger than the second one. That's the first order neighbors, right? And when you go to the second order neighbors, it's already indistinguishable from zero, basically. So you lose so much of these density externalities just by moving a couple of kilometers away. They still find some effects from the citywide density. Down on the fourth row, you have the citywide density. This is captured as an accessibility variable. It's also a spatial variable, basically. But even that is half of the effect you observe from the density that originates from the very neighborhood you live. So that this is a very local effect they find. And this is kind of important because if you think the policy implications of density, so you want an urban milieu, you say, because that you want people to, for example, tap on the resources available to them. What does that mean? Where are these resources available to them? If it's about human interaction, for example, is it really the urban density that is creativity inducing or innovation inducing, or is it a more local density that you should be after? Depending on the scale at which you observe these externalities, the kind of policy you may design to curtail the formation of density or encourage it may be completely different, right? So that's the take from it. But what is really interesting, and I didn't have that, I believe, here. No, it's actually the table right next to it. They see that this effect is particularly valid for people with a university education and above. So that it's a very human capital dependent mechanism also, that it can't be replicated for every cohort you observe in the city when they break it down to different groups of people based on education. That's also an important thing that they find in the previous research too, but once again, at such large spatial scales and not nearly as high of a premium as the previous research suggests. I mean, at 33, what they find is a 2.8% higher wage premium associated with doubling the neighborhood density. Then again, you can double the size of the neighborhood in terms of population several times, right? Going from one neighborhood to another neighborhood. You can have twice as many people, and then you can have that again and again. In the same city, you have so much, so high standard deviation when it comes to the distribution of population. So actually, by doubling, I mean, how many places do you have that has the multiples of the population you observe in an area? So in terms of scaling of the effect, this is not a negligible effect, but not nearly as high as what the previous research found, like these 25%, 30% higher productivity or productivity returns associated with density. So I suggest that we actually break into rooms now. And I had this idea, and I got inspired by your profiles also. So let's find 3 spatial determinants in a very similar fashion. So let's say that we are running an econometric model. On our left-hand side variable, this time we don't have wage, but we have rate of crime at the neighborhood, right? And we want to estimate it against. So we have a bunch of individual characteristics we control for, or the cohort characteristics we can control for. But what's most important, for the sake of simplicity, for the sake of convenience, we are going to assume that these things are sufficiently, the things that we will find are sufficiently uncorrelated with each other. They're not probably perfectly orthogonal to each other, but we can live with it. We can live with whatever correlation they have between one another. So that's a non-issue in our hypothetical scenario, basically. But what's really important for me, that we try to find 3 determinants of neighborhood level crime that operate at 3 different spatial scales. This can be neighborhood, this can be city, this can be the region. So think about the level of spatial aggregation at which you would measure this particular variable. And let's try to argue why. Why do we think that this thing needs to be measured at the city level, but not at the neighborhood level? Or why do we think that it needs to be measured at the regional level, but not at the city level? So it's coming up with an imaginary empirical design in which we are estimating not wages, but crime rates at the neighborhood level against 3 chosen spatial determinants. And each of these are going to be at a different spatial scale. And we will have to have a good enough reason for measuring it at that scale, but not in another scale. Does that make sense?
Yep. Do you guys have any questions at all? Because it's a good time to ask them, since now you're going to go into breakout rooms and work on this project for 15 minutes. If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and ask. Because when you go into the brainstorming sessions, it will be too late to ask those questions. Okay, so Emre, I think you can arrange people into breakout rooms, or?
I would like to join. I mean, let's do it in a way that I can also join in.
I make you co-host, and you can just visit all of the rooms. And Akuluj, you are also.
Yeah, that sounds. Oh. Well, when I proposed a few topics of all the topics I look into from this spatial lens, so to say, and try to dissect the geography into pieces and build it up again. One of the topics I brought up to Akın was ethnic enclaves, and we thought maybe this is a good strand of literature that we can also discuss. And it's pretty similar to the crime discussion we had, in a way that it is a very sensitive topic because it's very politicized. It's very politicized in almost every country. When you start talking about ethnic enclaves and ethnic clustering at the spatial level, there's some conflict attached to it. Depending on your political preferences, you have different preferences for the ethnic clustering also, or ethnocultural clustering, so to say. And in some geographies, we see very successful examples of it, and in others, it's rather terrible. So it's a very empirical field rather than being theoretical. So I thought actually this is a good place to talk about some of the empirical applications I've been working on. And while doing that, I can also talk generally about the data problems that we faced. And some of these problems, I'm going to be honest with you guys, some of these problems we are able to solve, and some others not so successfully. It's an evolving literature. Once again, it's a literature that's pretty old when you look at the concepts and theories related to formation of ethnic enclaves and segregation. But when you look at the empirical applications, it's a rather new literature. Here, the checkers board that you see is from a Schelling's model from 1974. This is mostly used in the tipping point literature. So the first time this was being discussed in the literature was in relation to native flight. That's what they call it. So that's what I call it too. And I'm sure it's not right to call it like that in some environments, but this is what the literature says. So the idea is that you have a neighborhood that's predominantly native population in a country, and you see a shift, a demographic shift. People start moving in from other places. These are immigrants from different, in the context of United States, maybe from different states, but mostly we're talking about people that move to the country, so that there's a change in the demographic composition at the neighborhood level, let's say. And they observe that there's a nonlinear relationship between the number of incoming immigrants into an area and outgoing natives. So that nothing happens up until a certain point. And then all of a sudden, when the share of the total population in the area reaches to a certain point, which is what we call a tipping point, you start seeing native populations moving out. Which then triggers a further sort of segregation pattern. That may or may not be a good thing, right? That I have no normative position about this, but this is an empirical regularity that they observe in places with rapid demographic shifts at a certain spatial scale, basically. Tipping point is something I started working on quite recently, and it's a serious empirical challenge. I'll ask you some questions in the end that I haven't been all too successful answering. But in the meantime, I'm going to show how we think about ethnic enclaves in other contexts, using some of my published papers, but also some of the ongoing work. So this has been something I have been very interested in, even during my PhD, but I got this advice. I don't know if it was a wise advice or not, that I should not work on something that I am too heavily opinionated about, because I was I came from a very opinionated place in my early 20s about ethnic enclaves. I had ideas about what's a good enclave and what's a bad enclave and how you can organize these things and so on and so forth. Over the years, I lost my confidence in my own ideas. So, and I lost it to an extent that I realized that, okay, now it's a good time for me to study this question, actually, because the more you travel, the more you see that ethnic enclaves can differ in their natures quite a lot. And there are some that are very pleasant and very vital environments for the people that are living in them. And there are some that are quite terrible places to live, and they produce all sorts of undesirable outcomes for the residents in these places, right? So I was very much drawn to this bifurcation that we observe, basically, across different cities in the same country sometimes, but particularly across different countries. The first piece of empirical evidence I started to dig into is just to see, first of all, when I talk about immigrants, I very rarely talk about labor migrants. almost everything I worked on is about push migrants, forced migration, basically. So people that moved due to civil conflicts and other related causes, sort of they were displaced or they were part of a displaced population. And Sweden was a very, very interesting place to study this phenomena in particular, because it received the highest number of, I'm sorry, somebody's trying to log into something I own, sorry.
Oh no.
No, it's fine. I said, I hope by the end of this lecture, I may have lost all my accounts. We'll see, fingers crossed. It's a very interesting country. It's a humanitarian superhero. That was the narrative that they had, particularly following the Second Iraq War. Between 2005 and 2006, they had a very big migration. They received a very big migration wave from Iraq, and this kept growing over the years. And the Syrian refugee crisis, during the Syrian refugee crisis, that was a big hit. It received the highest number of refugees per capita. Given that it's a relatively small country in terms of population, about 10 million we're talking about, it received a rather large number of refugees compared to its European Union peers. And the other aspect of Sweden that is quite interesting, of course, is that it has the largest labor market gap. So if you look at the share of, or the gap in employment rate between native born and the non-EU immigrants, you find that places like Netherlands and Sweden are not faring too well. That's in part due to the economic structure or the structural issues at the labor market, in part the incentive structure around social welfare, and also obviously there's a selection mechanism through which people also sort themselves into different countries. Despite the fact that we're talking about forced migration, I shall also note that a vast majority of the people that moved to Sweden moved on foot, actually. So they weren't allocated by way of a central refugee placement system. So it wasn't a quota migration to the extent that you should see if you are doing things by the book. That came much later. Sort of the idea of a country having to process the asylum application at the port of entry came pretty much after the Syrian refugee crisis, right? So it's an adjustment that happened at the EU level that didn't exist before. So people actually had sequential migratory routes. So they passed through several countries and found the location that they found under those horrible circumstances, they found more acceptable to settle down. And that means that as a welcoming environment, but also it's a very generous environment we're talking about. So the social transfer or benefits, they're pretty generous in Sweden. When we think about the geographical sorting of refugees, we see, however, a rather dire situation, actually. So we're talking about a country, I mentioned that 290 places that can be identified as cities because they have their own local government. Although some of them should not because of the population decline, as I mentioned, which is a very unpopular opinion to raise again. These places that were declining in their population over a number of years, over more than 2 decades, basically, had vacancy in their housing market, right? And when you have a shock as such as a migration shock, the first thing that you need to prioritize is a roof over their head, which meant that the government, actually the central authority, placed these people in places that are already in decline. So in order to capitalize on the available housing in these places that were declining in population, a very good share of the refugees were placed in places that weren't doing so well in their housing market, which is obviously a very strong indicator of how the place is in terms of its local labor market. So the initial location of these people were not at all ideal, and their ability to sort themselves out of these places and into more urban areas is very limited given the housing market structure. So that they all of a sudden ended up not only being in a country that is pretty alien to them, but also in environments that are not necessarily very vibrant in their local labor markets. Those that are more able from a local labor market perspective could make moves, so that we have observed these mobility patterns also, but most of the people also got stuck in these not so nice local labor markets with very few jobs and industrial structures that are not suitable for absorbing unemployment, particularly for what is referred to as unskilled labor in the labor literature, right? What means like relatively lower education and lower labor market experience. So that brought us to the topic of ethnic enclaves. So if you don't have a vibrant local labor market, and you face all of these challenges in your proximate area with regards to your entry to labor market, what are the other resources that you can tap on? So what kind of support systems available to you in your location? May you have chosen that location yourself, or be placed in that location from a central authority, basically. So Swedish registry data here, yes, that data, once again, it's very handy. Particularly because of this geocoding element, right? So not only we know where these people are in terms of the city they live in, but we can also observe the very initial location that they appear in the data. So the moment you have a residence permit, so you are processed in the Swedish system, the moment you leave an asylum home, basically, and provided with an alternative location, you appear in the data, you appear in the registered data. So there's, depending on when you arrive to the country, there's about a year or so, a maximum of a year or so between your entry to the country and you appearing in the data. And during that period, most of the refugees live in the asylum centers and asylum homes, basically. The data we call the Swedish Longitudinal Integrated Database for Insurance and Labor Market Studies. You can ask 1 million different questions about it. It is stored in Statistics Sweden, by the way. So this is like a tree. And depending on which project you work on, you have access to a branch of it. So not every variable I have access to, somebody else can work with. And some variables that some other person working on another project has access to, I can't see, for example. So it is you have to be very specific about what kind of variables you need. And Statistics Sweden is very smart with how it monitors the use of data. We are using their servers so that we connect to their servers and do our job there. But what is really interesting is that depending on the variable you ask, or rather the variable you ask, the probability of you having access to that variable is highly dependent on the spatial scale you ask that variable, right? So something about ethnic origin, or you never have ethnicity data in Sweden to begin with, but country of origin, for example, may not be that sensitive at the city level, but if you are actually able to identify that person's location down to 250 by 250 square meter grids, these are very small areas, there's some issue with anonymity, that in some areas there will be just one or a few people maybe in that block from that country, and somebody by a computer being able to identify that person is a big trouble. So for that reason, they actually came up with country groups. So they're very sensitive with sharing some information at some spatial scale. It's a very sensitive issue to that end. But we have what we need to have to do the kind of work we do that I'm going to show you in a second. And we have data that covers from 1992 onwards, 1990 onwards, but the first few years are a little shady with regards to geocoding. So I often use data covering the period from 1992 onwards, basically. And again, this geocoding can be used to sort of build what you can deem to be neighborhoods at different spatial scales, but also you can identify if somebody finds a work, for example, where this person finds the work. It doesn't even need to be within the same municipality, and you can calculate the distances between the residential address and the work address, basically. So the first thing we did with my ex-supervisor, a very good friend, Johan Claesson, was, okay, so let's start from the basics. We're not going to do rocket science. There's an entire literature on ethnic enclaves and segregation. A lot of work, mostly from the United States. It's a very US-centric literature, of course. And the kind of ethnic enclaves you see in the United States are not necessarily representative for the kind of ethnic enclaves you see in Europe, as you may all know. They are two completely different sets of enclave formations to begin with. In the US, you see this historical formation of ethnic enclaves, often very close to the city centers. In Europe, it's the opposite. They're often at the outskirts of the cities. where project houses or several housing projects for the working class population was built for the native population in maybe the 50s and the 60s during the height of the in-house production time in Europe, so to say. And then when these places became vacant, they were populated by the incoming immigrant population. So it's a completely different type of residential segregation you observe in these two different places. That's why we felt like some of the things that were discussed in the literature were a little too US-centric and didn't really address our problems with regards to measurement in particular. And what I mean by measurement is this. First of all, you see in the literature that ethnic enclaves, the term ethnic enclaves and segregation, they are sometimes used interchangeably, which is a very problematic situation. Those of you who are familiar with segregation studies or things, empirical work on segregation, know that when we talk about segregation, you use a number of ways. Most common way is to use something like a dissimilarity index to show how different the population distribution is in an area with respect to the larger area that it is nested within. So what do I mean by that? So I take a neighborhood and I look at, for example, Turks in that neighborhood, right? It's not sufficient for me to know what % of that neighborhood population is from Turkey. I need to know the general distribution of the Turkish population in the larger area so that I can say, okay, the people from Turkey are overrepresented in this area or underrepresented in this area. So this is a relative population distribution we are talking about when we're talking about segregation. Whereas in the context of ethnic enclave, anything above, if you look at the literature, empirical work on it, anything from 5% to 70% is considered to be an ethnically concentrated environment in the empirical work, right? So if you have 5% of a population of a neighborhood coming from a particular part of the world, that suffices you to call that, okay, so there exists some enclave here, that there is some formation of enclave here. That doesn't necessarily mean that these people are segregated away from the native population, right? So ethnic enclaves, so segregation has a bad name for a good reason, but ethnic enclaves can be for that reason good or bad, depending on the nature of the ethnic concert or ethno-social concentration that you observe, right? So one thing that we wanted to look into was this: how can we actually differentiate between the notion of segregation for the immigrants, particularly for the refugees we have that migrated from Balkans following the Yugoslavian war in 1990 to 1993 period, and the Middle Eastern migrants that migrated following the Second Iraq War between 2005 and 2006. Very specific group of people, all were forced to be displaced. They came during a certain period in time following a shock. It's a very sort of clear-cut group of people to also rather homogeneous groups of people to look into. And they're very different from each other, which is also, so they're sufficiently similar to one another, in terms of the way through which they came to the country, but they're sufficiently different from one another to compare them, also because they migrated at two different points in time and they're culturally different, which allows them to integrate more or less into the society is the idea. So we wanted to look into these two groups, segregation and ethnic concentration, differently at different spatial scales to see where we see positive effects, where we see negative effects, completely exploratory work, nothing causal, just to identify the general patterns, if there are any, through which segregation and ethnic concentration may relate to the probability of an immigrant finding his or her first job in the country or becoming self-employed, sort of being a labor market insider rather than outsider. Do we see any general patterns? What we find, as we predicted, is that segregation, no matter which spatial scale we observe, so how segregated a neighborhood is with respect to the city it belongs to, or how segregated the city is with respect to the region it belongs to, right? Segregation measured at whichever level turned out to be a rather negative thing for either of the outcomes. It's bad segregation. We don't want people to be segregated, fine. But ethnic enclave is different. We found some really interesting and rather positive association between ethnic concentration, particularly at the neighborhood level, and things related to finding the first job or sorting yourself into self-employment. By the way, when I say self-employment, I mean meaningful self-employment. So because we have the wage data too, right? It's not just you going and registering yourself as something somewhere. So we can differentiate between who is actually engaged in a meaningful economic activity or not. This is a very messy, this is the kind of slide you shouldn't have, but I have just wanted to show you what kind of variables we work with. So we know whether they're employed or entrepreneurs. So this is a standard binary probabilistic model. We run some logit estimations against a bunch of individual variables. We have age, a male dummy, very crude but standard in the literature, duration of education in years. We can also differentiate between the education they came with and the education they acquired in the country, which is an interesting thing I want to look into later sometime in the future. If you guys have interesting ideas on this, please let me know. And then we have a bunch of spatial variables, right? We control for neighborhoods density. We use not the grids, but a somewhat larger neighborhood definition in Sweden. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we know the municipal size in terms of population in the municipality, local labor market size, population in the local labor market area. So all of these structural things that can actually dictate the supply and demand mechanism. So if there are a lot of people, then there are a lot of jobs. If there are not a lot of people, then there are not a lot of jobs. So those kinds of things we want to control a way to have the essence of enclaves and segregation on these two labor market outcomes, basically. And what we did that I found interesting enough to look into, at the very least, is to look at the ethnic concentration at three different levels, right? At the neighborhood level, at the city level, at the regional level. And the same exercise we did for the segregation, looking at how segregated neighborhood is with respect to municipality, how segregated neighborhood is with respect to local labor market area, and so on. And well, generally speaking, for immigrants coming from Balkans, for example, ethnic concentration and segregation we find always negatively or sometimes insignificantly related to the probability of employment and entrepreneurship. So they don't seem to benefit from neither of these two things. But when it comes to the Middle Eastern immigrants, and these are mostly Iraqis again, that came after the Iraq War, results are mixed when it comes to ethnic concentration, particularly at the neighborhood level. For example, we see some really positive effects associated with having peers from where you are. And this is controlling for the overall ethnic concentration in the municipality, right? So they, first of all, sort themselves into more ethnically concentrated areas, and they also seem to be able to capitalize on it better than the other immigrant group, which also wondered us whether there's some temporal effects. So we looked at whether these effects from segregation, whether they have perhaps some positive effects at the time of arrival that dies out over time, or perhaps even the effect changes over time, that initially you find this social network to be helpful to you to acquire informal information, maybe on some know-how on how to find jobs or how to start a business. But perhaps after a while, you get into this lock-in effect that is discussed in Borjas and related literature, that it may not necessarily be good in the long run, but it may be good in the short run, vice versa, depending on the context you have at hand. And we see some evidence of that too, so that initial support may not necessarily be a good thing in the longer run for either of the outcomes we observe for, particularly for the Balkan group, because we had long enough time to observe actually their sort of duration of their activities, both in terms of employment and in terms of entrepreneurship. So this was the first thing we did, and we just sent it, published it. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't rocket science. It was a nice empirical exercise to satisfy our curiosity more than anything. And it was interesting enough for us to sort of start thinking about different levels of spatial aggregation and how to think about ethnic enclaves. What's the right level of aggregation we should look into? It was an exploratory work for ourselves, if not for anybody else. Then with a bunch of other guys, I decided to look into self-employment. And the reason is this guy, Hayati, the guy in the middle. He's a very fascinating character from Konya in Turkey. He's running my favorite kebab place in Stockholm. I practically lived there for a while, and that led me to gain about like 6 to 8 kilos during my time in Stockholm in a very short period of time. It's one of the best kebabs in the whole world I found in Stockholm. I highly encourage you to go and visit his restaurant when you're in Stockholm. That's on Folkungagatan, called Amida. He originally actually is from Diyarbakir, but he has some roots in Konya too. He told me a story once, and I found it fascinating. So we used to chat quite a bit with the people there. First of all, everybody that works there, everybody is an immigrant, but they are not necessarily all from Turkey. But everybody is from somewhere from Middle East, basically. So it's a full Middle Eastern gang, fantastic people, super hardworking guys, always good service, great food, whatnot. And I always assumed that Hayati must come from a family of long tradition of restaurateurs, like those people doing good kebab, sort of father doing this kind of business or something. It turns out that he never ever cooked before he actually started this business, pretty much. He just, had the people in his network that was running this place. I think he worked in the kitchen, but really not in the cooking side of things so much. And the guy was planning to sell it. And he thought, okay, so this is a good idea. I'm actually going to get into this business. True entrepreneur, like the risk taker. And he acquired this place, turned it around. And now he has 4 restaurants in different places in Stockholm, in different neighborhoods, employs tons of people. Celebrities like to go to this place and eat kebab there and so on. And Zlatan is a frequenter and so on. It's a very interesting story to that end, that the guy sort of built what I call a kebab empire from a piece of information he acquired from somebody that was in his network. So all of these that are discussed in the literature, all of a sudden you remember them, like, well, okay, so you have people in your ethnic network and they have some knowledge of doing things that you don't know about. You can go and ask them and they would help you out if you are in a good enough ethnic network. It all sounds too abstract until you meet somebody like that. So I said, okay, what is the probability that you acquire this information in a very spatially sticky way? Meaning that your probability to become an entrepreneur, so start your own business as an immigrant, depends on not only the sheer number of people that are around you from where you are necessarily, but on the number of people that have done this kind of thing before, that has the knowledge of doing business like that, right? And that's one thing that is really missing in the literature, that the existing empirical work on ethnic enclaves do not distinguish much between the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of an ethnic enclave. Often when we think about an enclave, you just head count the total number of people coming from where you are coming from, but perhaps it's not everybody that is relevant to you, but certain people with certain type of experiences, right? If you are to start a business, you wouldn't go and ask a random guy from Turkey, but you would go and ask a guy who actually was somehow involved in that kind of business before. So somebody that's an insider. So you need an insider to acquire the knowledge. So that's at the heart of network literature, basically, but it wasn't so much incorporated into the empirical work. And we had a way, we thought, to do something about it, because we're not only able to count the total number of people, but we can also identify people with previous or existing entrepreneurial experience within that enclave, right? So we could differentiate between size effect. So you are perhaps more likely to start a kebab restaurant in that neighborhood because there are so many other immigrants, right? That's the size of the ethnic enclave, hoping that whatever you are selling will have enough demand. So that's the driving force. Or maybe you have a group of people that have done something similar. They started some business, so they have some know-how that can help you to start business. It's not supply and demand driven, but it's information driven, maybe this channel. So we are able to distinguish these two aspects of the ethnic enclave. And just to give you a visual idea, maps, I thought I should put at least a couple of maps. This is Gothenburg and Malmö, for example, when you look at the share of immigrants from Middle East, and you find certain areas. Rosengård, you may have heard in Malmö, it's a very problematic area. It's not the nice ethnic enclave you talk about. It's the kind of place where one police car cannot go alone. There were always like multiple police cars when there's an event that happens, an incident that happens. It's a very ethnically dense area. When we look at the share of entrepreneurs among immigrants, among the same cohort of people, we see not necessarily these two places to pop up as the sort of most concentrated places, right? So the highest population concentration and highest entrepreneurial concentration do not appear in exactly the same grids at the very least, when we look at very small areas. It could be a very large ethnic enclave, but there may not be that many entrepreneurs, for example. So we're talking about actually different types of environments all of a sudden. And we found, interestingly, and I thought there would be some general enclave effect, right? There would be some positive effects from size itself, that you would be more likely to start a business in an area with more immigrants, because you would think probably whatever you are selling would sell more. We found no evidence of a positive general ethnic enclave effect. So from size, we found nothing. When we control for the local members of the local ethnic enclave that are business owners. So almost all of this effect is captured by your peers who come from the same place, who have an entrepreneurial experience. So the probability of you as an immigrant starting a new business does not, in our empirical context, and I can't generalize it for all geographies, obviously, did not seem to depend on how many ethnic peers you have in your enclave, but it was very much dependent on how many of these people were insiders, like labor market insiders, entrepreneurs themselves. And and this is over and above the citywide characteristics, because we are looking at the variation across neighborhoods within the same city. We also looked into duration, because it could very well be that there's obvious endogeneity here, right? So that people that are entrepreneurial maybe have some traits that also are similar with one another, which means that they may sort themselves into similar neighborhoods. One thing that we found that is fascinating is that length of non-employment spell, so how long you have been unemployed prior to starting your own firm as a way of getting into labor markets, did not change the effects we observed from this entrepreneurial ethnic enclave variable. It had some effect, obviously. So the longer unemployed you are, the less likely you are to start a business. But introducing sort of controlling for that did nothing to the estimates that we were after, which is how likely you are to start a business because you have a lot of people that has business within your same ethnic enclave. Previous entrepreneurial experience, however, had an enormous effect on the probability of transitioning to self-employment, of course, and also that cut the effect we had in half of having other co-ethnic entrepreneurs in the neighborhood, which means that there's a higher churn of people with some entrepreneurial experience within these ethnic enclaves, which is very consistent with what the literature suggests. So when we found this, we were, okay, so this is good. We are onto something. The size versus quality thing. It's maybe discussed in one or two papers before. Cutler, Glaser, and Size has something in the United States. Dam had something in Denmark, looking into the size versus quality aspect of it. And we thought, okay, so this is a good opportunity for us to actually do something, not only for entrepreneurship, but also finding the first job for refugees, right? So this is with a bunch of other Swedes. These are completely different sets of people, except Johan Claesson was my co-author from my first paper that I mentioned on this issue, at the very least. One problem we had with the existing literature also was that in order to measure the causality, or rather in order to draw causal inference on the relationship between the ethnic enclaves and labor market outcomes, the literature liked to use these quasi-experimental setup where people were randomly placed in neighborhoods, and then they looked at these people and how their surrounding influenced their labor market outcome, which is a fantastic thing to do by some token. But the problem with that is that you may randomly place people into different cities, which is what the mechanism is in most of the cases. Both in Denmark and Sweden, they had this central placement policy. So you arrive to a country as a refugee, you stay in a refugee home for a while, and then you get the residence permit, and then the state shows you a particular location in a particular city, right? But what we discussed before about spatial scale comes into play here. So just because you are centrally placed into a city doesn't mean that your ethnic enclave will happen within the city boundaries, right? Your ethnic enclave will still be quite local. It's going to operate at the neighborhood level. So that's what we thought our contribution could be, because the other papers that did work on the size versus quality aspect looked at the city level enclaves. So how many ethnic peers do you have living in the same city? We thought this is too big. I mean, I don't know all the people from Turkey in Cambridge. It's impossible. But I know the ones that are working in the university that are living within a certain distance, right? Like, so you know the people that are closer to you, hence you interact with them more, which would be the sort of mechanism through which you acquire some of this information. And we again looked at the Balkan immigrants that moved from the Balkans, Serbians and Bosnians that migrated to Sweden in the early 90s. And also the Middle Eastern cohort that migrated following the Iraq war. Again, I mean, it's a very safe two groups of people to look into because of the way in which they migrated, but also their cohort characteristics. And we find and then we estimate the probability of finding the first job in the country ever using probability regressions, and we also run some duration models in order to account for the spatial sorting related endogeneity issues. We also use a bunch of instrumental, you guys are familiar with economists' obsession with instrumental variables. So we use a bunch of instrumental variables that account for the pre-existing demographic composition of these places to see that there's no individual self-selection into these neighborhoods that are already ethnically dense, basically. And it looks something like this. It's not very legible, I assume, but when I talk about grids, these are the grids. So you have, in this case, 250 by 250 grids that we create, and the concentration of immigrants, depending on the cohort you look into, may look quite different, and they don't always follow the total population density. Basically, and we find similar results in this paper too. So with the difference that the employment rate of the respective immigrant group in vicinity really facilitate the market integration of new immigrants. So this time we actually find some size effects, but we find that the qualitative aspect, so it's not the total number of immigrants, but the total number of immigrants that has a job that come from the same place as you do, that has an additional effect and even a larger effect in magnitude. So controlling for the size, you still have this qualitative aspect, even more importantly so. One thing I thought I should note though, when we split our sample into men and women in a very crude way, the way it's codified in the data basically, we find that overall employment rate has a larger influence actually on men's labor market integration. So the size matters more for the male population, whereas the qualitative aspects of the enclave, so how many people already have a job in the enclave, seems to matter more for women. So women seem to, or individuals that are codified as women in our data, seem to rely more on this informal information channels than the sheer size of the network, as something to look into, perhaps with some complementing qualitative studies, the way we think about it. We don't have a lot of soft data to back this up or say much about the mechanisms, but this is, I thought, is an interesting result. And this is one other paper that's been cooking for 4 years. I don't think it will ever be done. This is going to go to gray with me probably, because here we thought, okay, so now we're going to do something really interesting and different, and it's going to be awesome. And we didn't understand how difficult not only writing the paper is, I mean, doing the actual analysis is, but also explaining it. And now I'm going to use you guys as an experiment to see if anybody understands anything from what we do. So what did we do so far? You have an outcome variable. Somebody becomes an entrepreneur or remains unemployed. Somebody sorts himself or herself into labor market by way of wage employment or remains unemployed, right? That these are binary outcome variables. You can, of course, elaborate on them by looking at different wage cuts, which is what we did in a number of these papers. Is it meaningful employment? Are you self-sufficient? And all of these things can be identified by adding a number of restrictions to employment. So we don't just need to rely on the binary outcome. But still, the issue of causality is still there, right? So we find that, okay, we find these results for certain features of these ethnic enclaves by looking at the total number of entrepreneurs. We say, yeah, if this effect is there, it must be because they learn from each other. But we really don't have a solid evidence for that being the mechanism, right? There are multiple mechanisms through which, for example, an ethnic entrepreneurial network may influence the probability of you starting a job. It could be due to information itself, but it could very well be because of role models that you just see that even without acquiring any specific information, but get inspired by it. Maybe there are certain features of that area that is very inducive for entrepreneurship to begin with. So what we are seeing is just sheer sorting, right? That has nothing to do with the enclave characteristics themselves. And all of these problems are very difficult to tackle in the standard econometric approach we followed, but just played with different spatial scales. That is a different aspect of it from the existing literature. So we said, now we're going to do something different. We are going to actually try to isolate the information channel that we talk about a lot. The whole literature talks about the information channel a lot. And there exists, to this day, no proper empirical evidence for ethnic enclaves actually providing this kind of information. There are a lot of qualitative work from, particularly from urban sociology and anthropology, right? There are also a lot of anecdotal evidences, the way that I just shared with you, but we are sort of trying to find, is this a thing that is significant enough to be captured in an empirical context? And we thought, look at this paper from Kramars and Scans. They look at strong ties and the strength of strong ties. We sort of were quite inspired by their framework. That's not a spatial framework at all. So what they do is that they look at the young graduates and their probability to find a job in a particular firm with respect to their contacts in that firm, so family contacts and so on. So these are the strong ties, right? And see what the probability is with respect to having a contact at the firm level, and also how the position that you take is influenced by the position of your contact and so on. So that there's a strength of strong ties kind of framework that they play with. We took a play on this and sort of what we're doing, because it's essentially more sort of Gronovetta type of weak ties framework, right? You have these people in your network, but you are not so strongly tied to them like family members, but they are your network, so you can acquire information from them. What is really interesting that we could do is that, since we know where these people live and where they find their first job, right? We can then differentiate between things that are specific to the location prior to employment and things that are specific to the location post-employment. So the characteristics of the location in which you find your first job in the country. Imagine you held no job in that country before. Unregistered work is really difficult in Sweden. Wages, they are not so reliable, right? So you can always get a part of your wage cash, but you can't, I mean, it's very difficult to be employed and not appear in our data. So that's, to that end, it's a very solid data that we work with. So these location-specific things like norms and attitudes towards being a labor market outsider, how stigmatized it is within your ethnic network, or things like role models and so on. These are very specific to the residential location, right? You don't necessarily need to know where they work, or it shall not necessarily dictate the location where you find your first job. You just need to be exposed to these people in your vicinity, in your neighborhood, to learn from them in all sorts of ways. Whereas when it's about information, the specific information channel that is discussed a lot in the network literature, but also in the general ethnic enclave literature that I have a job somewhere, and I know Akın, and I say, Akın, you know what? I mean, there's a vacancy there, and I think you would be perfect. You should definitely apply for this job, right? Or alternatively, I work there, and I tell my employer, look, there's this guy that's really, really good. You have to hire him. Like that kind of information channel is what we're trying to isolate. So if your individual characteristics dictate the type of neighborhood you end up living in, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it is also going to dictate where you are going to find the job. So given that you find your first job, you will have all of these hundreds of alternatives in the city that's within the sort of realm of possibilities for you to find a job in. And we argue that there should be some effect from having people living around you prior to you finding your first job and where they have their existing jobs. So what's the probability of me finding my first job in a particular location because I have somebody in my ethnic enclave who already works there? So being able to link residential location to place of work gave us this kind of opportunity, right? Which then is a play on this causal inference on information channel. So this is the idea. You are in location E, you have all these alternative places that has available jobs to you for your first job, conditional on you having your first job. So given that you take a job, you sort yourself into employment, which specific location you will end up working at is then going to be dictated by a number of things about that particular place, including how central that place is, what kind of industrial composition that place has, how employment intensive that environment is, whatnot. But on top of all of these things, if you have somebody that already has a job there from your ethnic enclave where you live, that should increase the probability of you finding a job there. If you find a statistically significant result for this, that's sort of isolating the information channel that we talk a lot about. That's the idea. I'm not gonna go through everything here, but this is a standard conditional logic framework. Actually, it's not rocket science at all. So a bunch of things related to individual himself or herself that is associated with ability, and also things that are related to the residential location. So the probability of you ending up in that location because you have these individual characteristics such as place-specific norms and so on. These things will dictate the probability of you finding your first job, right? So that's where the endogeneity is, we said. But holding that constant, so given that you find your first job, what we're estimating then is the probability that you will find that job in a particular place of all the available places to you in your choice set. And this choice set is very large. We're talking about, I'm going to show you, we're talking about this grids after grids after grids, right? Every grid in the city, in the larger metropolitan area is within your choice set, basically. So what's the probability that you will end up working in that particular location is what we're trying to estimate. And again, the thing that I find interesting about this, if we can publish this and convince the readers, is that it's going to be a nice framework to isolate the information channel without needing any quasi-experimental spatial dispersal policy or anything that's very popular in this line of literature. So if you have similar data for any other country, this can actually be replicated rather easily, this empirical framework. So it can be tested for different geographies, for different groups of immigrants a lot. And being able to isolate the information channel, I think, is important because at the end of the day, it's opportunity cost, right? There are all sorts of government policies to engage these people with the labor market. And if you allocate the resources into something, you cannot allocate them into something else. And I believe this network building exercises, learning from your peers, is a very important thing. And it's probably an overlooked realm. So if you can convince that this is something to look into, maybe there's a better way of allocating resources into this problem too. Just to give you an idea, what we mean by diet-specific characteristics and workplace location characteristics. Diet-specific variables require us to know what's happening in your residential location, but also where you find your first job. So we know the distance between this residential location and the place of work. The longer the distance is, the less likely you are to find a job there instead of everywhere else in your choice set. We know the number of employees living in your residential location and working in potential workplace locations. So this is the total number of people where you live that has a job there, regardless of where they are from. They may be immigrants, they may be native Swedes, they may be an other group of immigrants too, right? And then we look at the number of people living where you live from your country of origin who has a job in this potential workplace. So it's an even added effect. So if there's a general information about that workplace, that should be mostly captured by the second variable here. If it's a distance or industry, spatial composition of the industry type of effect, that should be captured by the distance variable, because industries are not spread around in a random fashion in the city either. Then we also control for a bunch of workplace location characteristics, for example, distance to central business district. It could very well be that there's an industry that's clustered in that location that likes to hire a particular type of immigrant group that we may end up capturing. So to that end, we control for things like distance to central business districts, total number of employees in that workplace, and also total number of employments of that particular immigrant group, regardless of where they live. So if it's a place that favors Turks, we control for that too, right? That we are not capturing this kind of sorting either. And what we find that is pretty interesting by the way, just to give you an idea, the computational challenge we had. So luckily, the probability of finding a job anywhere beyond sort of 40 minutes distance drops down to nearly zero, which allows us to argue that looking at one metropolitan area is a sufficient enough coverage for us. So we don't have to work with the whole country, right? We have about 3,841 individuals. And the number of observations you see there, then they are the dyads, right? These are the grid pairs. So we have about 15 million, roughly 15 million observations that we need to work with for this one metropolitan area for the duration that we have. And again, we have the Balkan immigrants from the Balkans, immigrants from the, so that's, you guys know the drill now. So we work with the same cohort again and again. And what we find is pretty fascinating. I'm not going to make you look at this table too long, but one thing that is to note is that if you look at the diet-specific variables, you find that the effect from so that there's some information channel regardless of whether you are an immigrant or not. So if there are more people living around you who has a job there, controlling for everything else, you seem to be more likely to find a job there. So holding that constant, the specific information you acquire from your ethnic peers seem to matter even more. So that's the 1, 2, 3, 4 employees IMM variable that you see there. It's manyfold larger of an effect, particularly for the group that's from the Balkans, and we see a very similar trend for the Middle Eastern group too. So what is this? Exactly. So also we do this same exercise for people who we observe in one location, never moves for the entirety of the period, and people that optimize their location, right? To see if there's any other mechanism we are missing that may lead to these people ending up in different locations, hence capitalizing on this particular type of information. And we see virtually no effect between the movers and the stayers either. So just to give you an idea about the size, this is a very considerable size. So if the number of co-national commuters in the residential neighborhood increases by 1, probability of finding a job in that particular location increases for Balkan immigrants by nearly 20%. And for the Middle Eastern immigrants by 1.5%. And you can add to this number of co-nationals so many times, right? This is a marginal effect, basically. So you can scale this effect up if you are able to actually place yourself in a conducive environment. So this is it. I don't know when this paper will be finished. I don't think it will ever be finished. So this is probably going to be something that I'll be working on forever and ever, and somebody else will publish something on it with very similar data. But we'll see.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do that.
Yeah, while you're estimating the probability of finding a job while in a grid, while you are living in another grid, Are you taking into account the movers, the number of movers between these two grids from a specific country of origin, so that it might play a role in terms of information sharing within enclaves, within people from same country of origin?
Right, we do. So if you run a location fixed effects, that's exactly what you're doing, right? You are looking at the change in the number of ethnic peers then, by definition. So you're taking some information away, but you're introducing some information in return. So it's not the level-to-level relationship, but then you are looking at the change in number of ethnic peers in all of these aspects in terms of the diet, if you have a grid fixed effect, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So then it's the increase or the decline in the number of co-nationals that have a job in one particular location. That's exactly what we see. And if I don't know if I can move this one around, but the estimates, if you look at the fourth variable, employees INM, look at the very last column, that's exactly what we're doing, right? And the magnitude is pretty much the same as the one, well, it's slightly lower than what we estimate on the third column, on the third specification, basically. But it's pretty much the same for the Middle Eastern group, with or without this sort of change in the total number of people. That's a very valid point, right? That there may be some things that remain quite stable in the environment, and some things may change. Some places are exposed to higher churn of residential population. Yep. So, and another thing that I've been working on, I'm wrapping it up now, pretty much, is the tipping point. And this is the dangerous bit, because we decided to look into this tipping point literature that we found quite fascinating, very conflict rich literature, again, from the terminology used to the way things are studied here, looking at native flight in the US strand of literature, they call it sometimes the white flight. One thing we realized that built environment is not accounted for this sort of tipping point idea a lot. And again, the kind of data we have allows us to sort of look into nicer places, whatever nicer places may be. So the idea we have is that an increasing number of refugees may trigger outmoving of a native population after a certain tipping point. But how does this tipping point differ between different neighborhoods of different types of qualities? And this quality can then be captured by building quality, by access to amenities, access to transportation, access to central business district, and so on. And our results are very preliminary, so I didn't want to put anything here. But one thing that we hypothesized is that if you observe, for example, the native population moving out of a neighborhood after something like 5% incoming immigrants into an area, so that they see this kind of population decomposition effect after a certain tipping point, would we find this level to be higher in quote-unquote nicer places, more amenity-rich places with higher access to services and higher access to infrastructure? So perhaps it's not that you mind living near immigrants, as it is discussed often in the earlier literature, but that immigrants are sorted into areas with certain characteristics, and those are the characteristics that you mind to be exposed to, and the migration of immigrants is just a trigger so that you actually sort yourself into quote-unquote better neighborhoods in terms of quality of life and then access to services. Unfortunately, our preliminary results suggest that these amenities don't seem to matter much, which is the opposite of what we hypothesize. And this is, again, for Sweden, very specifically for Swedish neighborhoods. And we want to make sure that what we have is robust before we actually make any conclusions around it. But what I expected to find fell apart a little bit here. But I thought this is an interesting thing. This is a very interesting thing to bring up also, because then this allows us to play with different spatial scales back and forth, because some things related to quality of life and niceness, attractiveness of a place operate at their neighborhood level, and some things operate at the city level. So you may very well be optimizing within the same city across different neighborhoods. And for that, we use microgeography. Yep, I'm not going to read this. I left this because I like this. It's a nice quote from Borges about how careful we should be when we're working with working with space, basically. So over modeling, trying to over analyzing spatial data sometimes may lead to us coming up with what is the equivalent of reality itself, and that's not the game we're trying to play, I guess. I'll send this presentation. We can stop recording and I can stay around if you guys would like to chat a little bit, ask questions.
Well, that was incredible. Thank you so much. Like, this was, for me, I'm totally like coming from the outside. So this was, to me, an incredible crash course in spatial economics, or especially how a spatial economist thinks. And has been helpful for my own separate study on the spatial dynamics of violence and conflict, and especially how to think about it spatially. So I'd like to abuse my rights as one of the organizers and start with the first question. And it's a general question to maybe trigger some other questions from the crowd. And that question is, where do you think social media data would fit in this whole framework of estimation? Like, let's say you found an incredible computational social scientist